in time, we have convinced ourselves, both the Europeans and the Americans, that Russia is a mortal threat to dominate all of Europe. This is a ridiculous argument.
This is not about America's strategic interests. We don't really have many there.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Tucker Carlson's podcast to talk about the fact that the war in Ukraine isn't a winnable war, either from the United States perspective or from the Ukrainian perspective. He also gets into how this mess started in the first place and what are the ramifications for the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy going forward. Mearsheimer is one of the most brilliant foreign policy analysts on the planet, if you ask me, so let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Fact is that the Russians are winning the war, and there's no way that Ukraine can rescue the situation. If you look at the balance of power in terms of weaponry and in terms of manpower, the number of soldiers that each side has, the Ukrainians are in a hopeless situation. And furthermore, they're heavily dependent on the West for support. And President Trump has made it clear that he's not going to refill the Biden pipeline once all the weaponry in that pipeline runs out. So the Ukrainians are doomed. And if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians understand that. Their defenses are slowly but steadily collapsing. Now, one might say, well, can't we get a negotiated settlement? Can't we bring this war to an end? And the fact is that neither the Ukrainians nor the West, and here we're talking mainly about the Europeans, is willing to cut a deal that's acceptable to the Russians. So there's no way you're going to have a diplomatic settlement to this war. It's going to be settled on the battlefield, and the Russians are going to win an ugly victory, and you're going to have a frozen conflict.
Look, I mostly agree with them there, in terms of the size of the armies and the chances that each of them have when pitted against each other. That has been played out. Russia still occupies something like 85% or 90% of the Donbass, has remained in control of much of it for 3 years, essentially. There have been several Ukrainian offenses, but he's right about that. The only point of disagreement that I would raise to Mearsheimer here is that Trump actually hasn't made it that clear that he isn't willing to refill the pipeline when it comes to weapons to Ukraine, especially recently when he said that he was rearming them and has followed through with that. He's continued to supply them with intelligence, which we know is true. And as recently as yesterday, he got into a press conference when he said he's sick of even talking to the Russians. And it doesn't seem like peace is on the horizon or disengagement is on the horizon from the U.S. perspective yet. I hope that's true, but I don't see that happening. And it seems like Mike Johnson has a record in Congress for whipping Republicans into supporting this nonsense. So we'll have to see where that goes, but mostly agree with him in terms of where the war is going right now.
Why can't you have a negotiated settlement?
Because Russia has a set of demands. There are three main demands, and I'll spell them out in a second. But they are unacceptable to the Ukrainians. They're unacceptable to the West. Donald Trump may find them acceptable, but he's surrounded by people in his administration, and it's certainly true in the American foreign policy establishment, who wouldn't accept those demands. And the big three demands are, number one, that Ukraine has to be a neutral state. It cannot be in NATO, and it cannot have a security guarantee from the United States or from the West more generally. So it has to be neutral. Second is that Ukraine cannot have a significant offensive military capability. Ukraine has to be demilitarized to the point where it doesn't present a threat to Russia. And then third, and maybe most important of all, the Ukrainians and the West have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed Crimea and those four oblasts in eastern one-fifth of Ukraine that they now almost occupy.
Yeah, this is all true. And to be clear, these are the same set of demands that Russia's had the entire time. They're part of the draft treaty that Putin drew up and sent to NATO on the eve of when he invaded Ukraine, which that didn't start the war, by the way. That happened 7 or 8 years into what was already a civil war being embroiled around the Donbass. But when Putin did invade, prior to that, he sent a draft treaty to NATO with these demands spelled out, saying, hey, if you just sign these things into being and commit to these things, I won't invade Ukraine. And instead of doing that, Jens Stoltenberg laughed in his face and said, hey, we choose war instead, and that's why we have this war. To this extent. Of course, again, the war broke out soon after the U.S. helped in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government in Ukraine in 2014. But Putin's remained adamant and clear and consistent about what his demands are the entire time. So yeah, I agree with Mearsheimer that most forces in the West, and it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is interested in entertaining them, especially with people around Trump like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg, for goodness sake.
So in other words, you're asking Ukraine to give up about 20% of its territory, and the Ukrainians won't do that, and they won't agree not to be in NATO, and they will not agree to disarm in some meaningful way. So there's no way you get a settlement.
So, but there will be a settlement by your description, because there will be a victory. So there will just be, it's not an official settlement, but there will be a new status quo in which Russia controls a fifth of what was Ukraine. And that's just going to happen. So why wouldn't you want to get out of that with as little destruction as possible?
Amen. That's what Trump campaigned on. Remember how many times he told us, I just want the killing to stop. I just want the deaths and devastation to stop. That was good rhetoric, but it doesn't seem like Trump's being willing to put himself in the position where that's even possible, because disengagement would guarantee that. Zelensky would have no choice but to sign a peace, and the Europeans would have to inherit him as their problem. And don't get me wrong, the U.S. is the chief antagonist here and has been since the 90s, committed to expanding NATO, pulling out of the INF treaty, bombing Belgrade, completely violating their promises that were given by James Baker and Jürgen Krobog, working under Hans-Dietrich Genscher, in talking to Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War. And instead, the U.S. continued to plow forward and arm Ukraine and basically make it possible so they could set up offensive missiles essentially on Russia's border. The U.S. wouldn't accept this if Russia did this in Canada or Mexico. Not at all. And we shouldn't expect them to. So, I still hold out hope for a peaceful settlement, but it looks more and more utopian.
Well, you're going to get an armistice in all likelihood. And this is why we say you'll have a frozen conflict that will present all sorts of problems moving down the road. I have long argued that the Ukrainians should cut a deal now, because what's going to happen is the Russians are going to end up taking more territory, and the Russians have made it clear that any territory they take, they'll keep. And furthermore, more Ukrainians are going to die the longer the war goes on. So if you believe, like I do, and many people do, that Ukraine is losing, the smart thing to do is cut a deal now and minimize your losses, both in terms of territory and people killed on the battlefield.
Yeah, indeed. And Zelensky had that opportunity in the early months of this war to do that at Istanbul. He was actually offered a peace agreement by Russia, and in many regards, it seemed like he was willing to accept it. You had various accounts suggesting that they had essentially agreed to terms in this deal, but Boris Johnson and the U.S. State Department talked him out of it. And what have we gotten? $200 billion later from the U.S. Treasury. The war still, it rages on. Conscription laws expanded, Zelensky cracking down on political opposition, banning rival political parties, shutting down oppositional media, closing down Eastern Orthodox churches. And we're spun this stupid war propaganda narrative in the United States that we're there for democracy. It's absurd, and he's not going to get a better deal now. Now's the time indeed to cut a deal, otherwise he might suffer the loss of more territory pushing down toward Odessa. That is the truth.
But you just can't sell that argument. And
why can't you sell that argument?
I think it's probably nationalism in the case of the Ukrainians. The
Yes.
Ukrainians view the Russians as an existential threat, and they're willing to fight and die in huge numbers. They're willing to make incredible sacrifices to do everything they can to win this war. And
More and more, it's showing that that's not exactly true. That might be the case for some ultra-nationalist forces in Ukraine, but major protests broke out there over the last few days, challenging Zelensky in the first major way in the course of this war. And, a lot of the nationalist forces like Azov that support Zelensky will not let him come to an agreement that ends this war. They want to fight on. But a lot of regular people in Ukraine obviously don't. And there is some backlash there for the first time. It's worth mentioning.
they just won't quit. And in terms of the West, it's easy for the West.
So I just want to say I understand that and respect that. I think they're wrong, but I think it's self-defeating, but I certainly think it's honorable, those impulses. But I don't understand the West's stake in this exactly.
Well, I don't believe the West has a strategic stake in this for 1 second, but
Yes.
The Russophobia in the West is so powerful at this point in time that, especially among the elites in Europe and in the United States, that getting them to concede that the Russians have won this war or are going to win this war is just unacceptable.
And have legitimate security concerns on their border. I mean,
They're not allowed. The Russians are not allowed to have legitimate security concerns in the minds of most Western elites.
Yeah, and just think about that. Think about that, and then think about the hypothetical situation in which Russia was planting offensive weaponry along Mexico's border, pointed toward Texas and New Mexico and California and all the states in the U.S. ultimately, and what the U.S. response would be. And imagine more so that what if they flirted with Mexico joining BRICS, joining their military alliance? This would not be acceptable to any American, and yet the America propaganda machine makes us, tries to convince us that Putin's just trying to reconstitute the USSR, but they have obvious security concerns along their border with NATO support and weaponry pushed up against it.
why?
I don't know. It befuddles me. If you look at the Russian reaction to NATO expansion into Ukraine, which I believe is the taproot of this war, it's analogous to America's Monroe Doctrine. The
Yes.
United States, under no circumstances, would allow the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba or to
Yeah, we know that from history too, the Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly.
locate a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. That was just unacceptable. This is what the Monroe Doctrine is all about.
Yes.
We'd never allow China to station military forces in Mexico or in Canada. But yet we think we have the right to move NATO far enough eastward to include Ukraine and then put NATO assets, including American military assets, in Ukraine. And this is not of concern to the Russians. They shouldn't care. They should recognize that Ukraine has the right to do whatever it wants. NATO has the right to expand wherever it wants. And Russia has no say in the matter.
And that's exactly what they said about Trump when he was embroiled in Russiagate and the Russiagate hoax. They said he had colluded to win the election. He was siding with Putin and essentially representing Putin's interests within the U.S. government, all while Trump saddled Russia with sanctions over taking Crimea. He sent offensive weaponry to Ukraine for the first time in the form of a $400 million package that supplied the Aegis missile system. And, they threatened to impeach him over it if he didn't. He ultimately did that. And he said, hey, and they did impeach him too, by the way. And then he said, hey, I'm going to denounce Putin for giving Snowden asylum. He was antagonistic toward Russia before this thing broke out in Biden's presidency when Putin actually invaded. So this is what we're told, and this is actually the reality, and that's that the U.S. was bellicose toward Russia through many administrations, starting with Clinton in '94 when they decided to expand NATO beyond Germany.
The Russians, of course, don't accept this because they have a Monroe Doctrine of their own. But we can't get it through our thick skulls that This is foolish thinking on our part and is destined to lead to trouble, as it has.
It's interesting that the standard that U.S. foreign policymakers apply to Russia is different from a standard they'd apply to any other country, including China and even North Korea. They don't have the same level of emotion about any other place. It's Russia, Ukraine. And I find it baffling because on some level, this is, as you said at the outset, this is not about America's strategic interests. We don't really have many there. This is about an almost overwhelming emotional response from our leadership class.
Yeah, it's the result of empire building, and the thing that made Putin persona non grata to the Washington regime more than anything was that he denied a regime change operation in the early months of the U.S. war with Syria. Remember, Israel wanted to depose Assad because some money to Hezbollah flowed through Syria. Well, to do that, Obama joined in. He launched Operation Timber Sycamore, a CIA effort to supply arms to rebel groups within Syria. And guess who was within those rebel groups? Al-Qaeda. This was just 1 decade after 9/11, and I'm an American. I'm not an Israeli, and Hezbollah didn't knock down the towers. Al-Qaeda did, but you had the U.S. funding Al-Qaeda. You had famous pictures with John McCain over there posing with Al-Qaeda fighters trying to depose that regime in Syria. That's how it unfolded. But in the early months when regime change was on the table for the first time, it didn't finally happen until the end of December in 2024. You had Putin move Russian forces in to deny that regime change opportunity because Syria is an ally of Russia. It still is today. And that's when everyone completely turned on Putin completely, even though before that, of course, NATO was expanding more and more, despite the fact that the U.S. knew that that was the reddest of red lines. There was a famous memo written by William Burns, who later became the CIA director, but he was once the ambassador to Ukraine. He wrote back to his boss, Condoleezza Rice, saying, I've talked to all the political factions in Russia, and including Ukraine and NATO is the reddest of red lines, that if you do that, it will guarantee a future conflict with Russia. I'm paraphrasing, but you can still see this document, and it was released thanks to Julian Assange. So that's where we're at, and that's why Putin and Russia is viewed as supervillains, and you get all this propaganda that he's going to create a new Hitlerian empire.
To this conflict, to this region. I think it's weird.
Yeah. Well, I think also at this point in time, we have convinced ourselves, both the Europeans and the Americans, that Russia is a mortal threat to dominate all of Europe. This is a ridiculous argument, of course.
Do you think it is ridiculous?
It's a ridiculous argument. As you have seen, the war started in 2022. We're well over 5 years into this war. And the Russians have had a very difficult time conquering the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. Just think about that. Over 3+ years, they have been unable to conquer all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that they've annexed. Please tell me how this army is going to overrun all of Ukraine, then overrun Eastern Europe, and then overrun Western Europe. This is a laughable argument.
Yeah, they say Poland's next after Ukraine. Putin's going to take Ukraine proper, but there's no indication that he's dedicated near the amount of troops and resources to do that. And even if he did, it's not our problem. If you're really America first, you should believe in disengagement, because disengagement is the surest thing that will force a peace. People say, oh, that'll just give Putin license to move right in. Well, not if Europe controls its own affairs and comes to an agreement, and Europe wouldn't be able to talk bellicose and antagonistic toward Russia if the U.S. wasn't involved. It's not my problem. It really is not the problem of the American people over which regime controls the Donbass. The U.S. has no vested interest or security concerns in the Donbass. It's just so absurd. I can't even believe I have to make these arguments, but the U.S. is under no threat unless it rattles sabers with Russia and nuclear power. And, we're pushing toward brinksmanship every day. This is the new Cold War.
Furthermore, if the Russians are foolish enough to try to occupy Western Ukraine, they're going to find themselves in a quagmire. They're going to find themselves dealing with a huge amount of resistance from all of those ethnic Ukrainians in the western part of Ukraine who hate Russians. This is why I don't think Putin is going to even try to conquer the western half.
Much less
Ukraine.
Poland and Romania and the rest.
Exactly. Their view on that, by the way, in terms of occupying Eastern Europe, is we've been there, done that, and it did not work out very well. Remember, they occupied Eastern Europe roughly from 1945 to the early 1990s when they pulled out after the Cold War ended.
Yeah, that doesn't actually speak glowing about policy that took place during the Soviet Union when the Soviet bloc expanded to include those countries. And hey, the regime that inherited the Soviet Union was largely composed of the heroes that overthrew the forces that remained in the generations before, like those loyal to Stalin and Khrushchev. Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev are not Stalin. They never were. And the U.S. broke all their promises, essentially, toward Gorbachev. And I think Gorbachev is one of the, most heroic people of my age, for sure. But that's where we're at. And there's no indication that Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. It's absurd. Whenever you hear that, people often point to these quotes that say, hey, the fall of the Soviet Union was the most devastating thing that could have happened or something. Because Putin did say that. And yeah, if your country comes to an end, I think you would have people saying that regardless. In the United States, they would certainly say that. That's kind of like a natural reaction. He was on the inside of the government of the Soviet Union. But he's remained remarkably restrained during the West until the U.S. started to put weapons against his border, overthrow the Yanukovych government, withdraw from the INF Treaty, etc.
They had to invade Hungary in 1956. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. They had to put down a major insurrection in East Germany in 1953. They almost went into Poland 3 times. They had their hands full dealing with the Romanians and the Albanians and the Yugoslavs. I mean, the idea that a country like Russia is going to, invade and occupy and run the politics of countries in Eastern Europe is a remarkably foolish idea. And again, they don't even have the military capability to do that.
But that is the idea. And when you talk to Europeans about it, as I often do, they say that Putin's aim is to restore the Soviet Empire. And he said that, and, just listen to what he says. He pines for the Soviet era, and he wants to restore it.
He's never said that. In fact, he said that, he can understand why someone in his or her heart pines for the Soviet Union, but in his or her head, it makes absolutely no sense. He said that.
Yeah.
The idea that you can recreate the Soviet Union, number one, and then 2, recreate the Soviet Empire is a pipe dream. And you might not like Vladimir Putin, but he is a very smart man. He is a first-class strategist, and he surely understands that, the idea of recreating the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire makes no sense at all.
Absolutely right, and a lot of people won't believe this, but, I'm old enough to remember days in which Putin was considered a very pro-U.S. president of Russia. In fact, he generally was. He wanted good relations with the U.S., good trade relations, etc., and at one point, no one admitted otherwise. In fact, Bush, famously, George W. Bush, said, I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw an honest man. He was on good terms with Washington until the later stages of NATO expansion and the things I talked about earlier. The denial of a regime change in Syria, the U.S. bombed Belgrade and Serbia for over 40 days, I think 42 days. The U.S. overthrew the Yanukovych government in Ukraine. It withdrew from the INF Treaty. It was putting weapons into Ukraine, flirting with Ukraine being part of NATO. Successive presidential administrations said that. And Putin only became the enemy of the Washington military machine after those things happened. After, he denied the regime change in Syria especially. And that's what we're dealing with now, and it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, it's really damn sad that it's this way because there were so many off-ramps to battling and to war in Ukraine over this. It's crazy. And the U.S. fanned the flames all the way through. The Clinton presidency, the Bush presidency, Obama, and then Trump. And, for all the antagonism between those candidates and the clash of ideologies, the presidential elections that mean so much, there was striking continuity in the American foreign policy regime and foreign policy apparatus during that time that continued this wave of NATO expansion into 5 different waves. The first one happening in the late 90s, and then the second one in which the Baltic states joined was in 2004. And then there was another wave. And, sooner or later, you're going to get bad results, especially when you are told, and we know from documented evidence that the U.S. government was told that Ukraine in NATO was the reddest of red lines. Well, what did Obama care? What did George W. Bush care? What about Kamala Harris care about that? Well, they continued to flirt with that idea, saying it publicly, and it was really stupid. And that's where we are now. The only thing that will save the U.S. from this slaughter is disengagement. There's no stake in the U.S. there. It's to withdraw now. Trump was actually pretty good on this in terms of his campaign rhetoric, but of course he didn't follow through. And, I think a lot of his base feels, very disheartened that he didn't follow through with that. That was a major part of his campaign, is stopping the war in Ukraine. He famously said, "I'll stop it in 24 hours." And I think even the most trustworthy loyalist Trumpian wouldn't have thought that that was imaginable, but they really believed that he wouldn't, straight away appoint Marco Rubio, Keith Kellogg, and Lindsey Graham to surround him and be part of his diplomatic parties and lead him toward more intervention in Ukraine. And that's what we're getting now with this decision to rearm Ukraine. It's a slap in the face of not only a lot of his base that supported disengagement, but also dissidents that decided to hold their nose and support Trump, pull the lever down in the voting booth for him. And, what do you get for it? You get more war. As Tom Woods says, my good friend, no matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain. And nothing shows that more than the American foreign policy regime as it comes into power in successive administrations. But I do want to hear from what you guys say. Let me know down below. Is Mearsheimer right? Is the war in Ukraine unwinnable for the U.S.? What can the U.S. do to get out of this thing? Will it just take disengagement? Do you think a peace can be arranged while the U.S. is bankrolling one side of that war? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker too. Love this interview. Mearsheimer's brilliant, no doubt about that. Only had a few things to kind of disagree with them a little bit here. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can support the channel, which I'll really appreciate. And in return, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.